Hello, hello, hello. How are people doing? Can you hear me? Let me know. Say something if you're on and you can hear me and you're ready to get going. I just saw a message that the way that I live stream classes is going to be going away August 1st. So I guess I'm going to be figuring out how to do this in a different way going forward. We'll figure that out very soon. All right, starting to see people. Cool, cool. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get going. Um, I want to just go over roughly, I think I forgot to put how long this will be, but I want to go over some of the basics of what we're looking for from this React course. Um, my plan is on Thursday to do more of a hands-on session to help get everybody, make sure that everyone is working in whatever environment we have. I'll be honest, I didn't yet follow up to see if I don't think we moved to the AWS Cloud9, or I didn't see any message that was set up for us yet. So tomorrow I'm going to play around with a couple different options in terms of online environments, just to see how those work and whether they would work well for us for this class, or whether we should just go down the path of working on everyone's local environment. If it's your local environment, it'll take a little more hands-on work to make sure everyone's functional on Thursday. If we choose an online system, and we'll be able to just roll with that instead. And yeah, I'll try and figure something out. If anybody heard anything on an official transition for Code the Dream to the AWS Cloud9 or something like that, let me know, because I did not yet. I'll hit up Daisy as well just to see if they ever finish that process. But regardless of that, we'll be moving forward with React stuff. So welcome to the React course. This is the same sort of overview we've had in our other ones, but I want to make sure we go over some of the basics at the beginning of each course. The schedule will be remote on Tuesdays and then on-site on Thursdays and Saturdays. That's still at the American Underground, the same place that we were before. So I'm looking forward to seeing people on Thursday in class. And that may vary a little bit, depending on the week and how everything works out. But that's the general plan. Also, and I don't have it on here, the goal for this, we're using a different, or I'll be going through some different tutorials than I did for the last time that I did the React course, where I did this Survive.js tutorial. It's a little on the dated side. The material hasn't been updated for 2.5, almost 3 years, I believe. So it's getting a little old in terms of some of its references. So I'm going to be trying to go through the official React tutorial, and then maybe we'll sprinkle in some other concepts and other things as well that I'll be pulling in from other places. But the goal will be to be able to finish that within 4 weeks instead of the 6-week or longer courses that we've had before. This one's going to be a little more condensed. And I think that's very possible, especially just going through the React tutorial by itself. In fact, 4 weeks may give us time to really touch on some of these other topics, or even dive into building out some larger React applications while we're doing that. As usual, feel free to speak up. Well, I'll have a note on that in a minute too, but as usual, feel free to speak up in Slack during the class. I've got another computer up with that Slack window open, so if you have any questions, you're saying anything, or you want me to explain something differently or go over it again, I went too fast, it wasn't clear, please speak up. The more that you guys engage, that you'll get out of the class, really. And almost all the time, people have the same questions. Somebody else is asking the same question as you. So what tools will we be using? It's pretty much the same ones we've gotten pretty comfortable with, hopefully, from some of our previous classes. Slack, of course. GitHub, hopefully we should be using GitHub and putting all of our code up there, because we want this to be, it makes it much easier to collaborate with each other. It depends on how easy that is to hook up into the different tools that we've been talking about as well. And then again, if you have a strong preference, this is one of those things. The earlier you speak up, the more likely it is it will move in a direction. But looking at what environment we're going to use for the development, right? I'll show you stuff in REPL IT today when I do the demo of some basic React stuff near the end of class. So you'll be able to get to see a little bit of what that looks like. But other options are the AWS version of Cloud9, which I don't know if we did anything official with, but if nothing else, we'll figure something out if people really loved their Cloud9 environment. We could also do local workspaces, just working on your local computer. Or there's a couple other sort of React or React development environments online. I think sandbox.io or something like that. Code Sandbox, I can't remember, is a popular one. So if anybody has a really strong preference for one of these, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just be looking for what I think will make it the smoothest experience for everybody. All right, going back to the questions bit, right? Like, you're going to encounter a lot of new syntax in this class. There's a lot of new syntax with React. We're going to be really ramping up the speed in terms of how we'll cover material, because React is not really something that you're doing very small bits for. It's really a large application building tool. A lot of times you're not building very tiny things, although one of the beautiful parts about React is your large application is built from very small things. But you shouldn't feel intimidated. You shouldn't feel like you missed something if you're not sure how something works. Ask questions. Somebody else is probably asking the same question. Is there much of a learning curve between REPL.IT and AWS? I'll show you a little bit of what it is, and you guys can give me a little bit of your opinion of how that feels. It feels similar to the Cloud9 environment, but I haven't done the AWS Cloud9. I don't know if that's going to feel exactly the same. I guess I need to spin up that environment maybe tomorrow and give that a feel and see what that's like. It might feel exactly the same as the previous Cloud9 environment, which has its benefits. So first thing I wanted to do, it's been a few weeks, right? We have been off for 4 weeks or so. So I want to do a quick review of just some JavaScript concepts, syntax, things like that, to refresh this stuff in your mind. Hopefully, at least the first part of this should be very familiar. We've done a lot of coding on this. But the second part is a lot of the newer syntax that we introduced. So that may not be quite as fresh, but it's very important to get familiar with it for the class. So we'll start. We've got a set of data types in JavaScript, right? The data types that we have are Boolean, which is just true or false. We've got numbers. Unlike other programming languages, there aren't integers and floats and stuff like that. There's just a number in JavaScript. We've got strings. That's just a string of characters. That could include numbers or anything. And then we get into some of our more interesting data types. Then we have objects. Objects are really pretty much all of JavaScript outside of those primitive data types is an object of some kind that you're working with. And these are just very basic examples of some of these. Then you've got undefined, which is a data type, and it means like you've got a variable, but it didn't get defined to something specific. And then you have null. And this is one of those quirks of JavaScript that you run across, which is that it has undefined and null. Most programming languages only have one of those. And in fact, some people argue that the existence of null in programming languages in the first place is a huge source of bugs and should have never happened, but requires a different type of programming language to not have that. So next bit is, this is just a set of statements that performs a task or calculates a value. That is just, anybody want to take a guess at what that is before we fill it in? Yeah, a function, right? Functions. A function is a set of statements that performs a task or calculates a value. That's one of our primary building blocks that we're going to be working with in React, are these function aspects, right? So this is just an example of a square function. It takes in one argument. It has, one parameter, one argument, num. Oh, look, it's not even right. It returns x times x. Look, my code is completely wrong. It should be x here. So that's fantastic. Talking about objects, right? Let's just review them so that they're not intimidating, because we didn't work with them quite as much as some of my previous classes did. An object is just a collection of properties. In JavaScript, that's really all it is. In other languages, there's a distinction, but everything on an object is a property. A property is just a key value pair. Key might also be called name sometimes. A key can be any valid JavaScript string. It can actually be some other things too, but for the most part, we'll just stick with valid JavaScript strings as our keys. And a value can be any valid JavaScript value. So that can be another object. It can be a string. It can be a number. Really anything. And the common notion is when the value of a property is a function, then that property is called a method. That's very much stricter in other programming languages where methods are formally defined as something a little different than other properties. In JavaScript, they really are just another property. So we've got a basic example of an object here. And it's just got a few properties on it, right? It's got a name, real name, powers, and describe. And this object, there's nothing particularly fancy here. Each property, again, just a key value pair. The first two, their values are just strings. This third one, the value is an array, is just a special type of object. And then the fourth one, the value is a function. And so you would typically say that this is the described method if you're talking about it. And this can refer to any function inside of this object, can refer to the object itself using this syntax. Let me know if there's any questions about any of this stuff. Hopefully this is pretty much a review at this point because we've talked about this a fair bit. But again, any questions, pause, let me know. So as I was saying, in JavaScript, most things are objects. From core JavaScript features like strings and arrays, they're actually represented as objects under the covers, all the way to the browser APIs that are built on top of JavaScript, like the DOM layer and other stuff. And that's going to be important when we're working with React because we're going to work with functions and we're going to work with objects. And in some cases, we're going to work with them very interchangeably, depending on what we're doing. So getting comfortable with those different, what an object is, what a function is, these different things will be really important. A little bit fuzzy on the difference between a method and a function. It's a good question or a good comment. Really, there's not much of a difference because a method is a function. A function by itself, though, can also be something that isn't attached to anything. So the difference here would be, let me go back and I'll just grab my object. Oops. Let me grab my object that I defined here. There we go. We're going to put that right over here into, oops, again. Oh, it's editing that. That's not what I wanted. Man, I'm all over the place. All right. I know what I want. We're just going to come over here. So if I wrote a function like function hello world, and all this is going to do is return hello world, that right now is a function that you can call. So we can call hello world on its own. Then if I have this hero object, if I call hero.describe to describe, call that method, if you will, it's ultimately calling a function. It just happens to be called a method because it's attached to that object. So to maybe make that a little clearer, or the distinction there, is we have this hello world function that we've created, and then we've got describe here. I could do hero dot say hi equals hello world. And so I'm just assigning an extra property to my hero object, which is say hi. And if I call say hi, it will return that string hello world. That's me calling the say hi method of hero. But the say hi method of hero is really just a reference to this function. So the function is the concept of the self-contained bit of logic that you can call. And when it's attached to an object and called through that object, then you just call it a method. Thanks for asking the question. All right, so ES6, this is some of the newer syntax, or at least most of it is. Some of this we used very heavily in the last classes. So I just wanted to go over this again so that you guys know that, are getting familiar with it again, because it's going to be all over the place in the React code that we're writing, or any React code that you look at. So the first thing is a couple new ways to declare variables. We've got the let statement. The let statement just declares a block scope local variable, optionally initializing it to a value. So here we go. We've declared a variable equal to Daisy, and then we can just log it. For the most part, declarables using let, it behaves similar to declaring them with var, but there are a couple important differences. The first one is the aspect of it being block scope, and we talked a little bit about this before, which is JavaScript didn't really have a block scope of any declarations until let and const and some of that. So any block of code is set apart using these curly braces. That's the key to it being a block of code. And that means that the scope of any variable declared with let is only within the nearest containing block. So here we've got let b equals 22. And we also did a var a equals 11. And so when we log both of those in here, we get 11 and 22, as we would expect. But the minute we exit this block, the var variable isn't block scoped. It's scoped to whatever the function or global scope is. So when we log that down here, it logs just fine because we're outside of the block, but this doesn't exist just within that block. But B, it doesn't exist outside of the nearest block, which here. And so that's going to be a reference error if you try and reference it outside of that block. That comes up relatively often, but not every day. It'll be something that is useful to remember. So const is another way to declare a variable. It's like let. It also declares a block scope local variable. But the major difference between const and let is that the value of a constant, const, cannot be changed through reassignment, and it can't be redeclared. So let's look at some examples again. If we have let a equals 11 and we log it, okay, it's 11. And then we can reassign the value. So we gave it a new value of 22. That's fine. It's going to now take the value of 22. But if we declared something as a const b is 42, that's fine. We can log it. And if we try and reassign it to a new value, it's going to throw a type error because you're not allowed to change the value of something that was declared with a const. One note I'll have on this is you'll see some people say that you should just declare any variable that you never change the value of as a const. There's even some linting tools, some tools that sort of check for code style guidelines that will enforce that. I don't believe that that's true necessarily. I think const is really useful if you limit it to things that really should be constants. You know, like the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42. It's a constant. You can't change it. But I think it loses some of its power if you put it on other types of variables. So that's a debate in the community. I don't say there's right or wrong answer, but you'll definitely see some pretty strong opinions on it. So another, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, how is const different from a global variable? That's a good question. Const is within the block scope as well. So const doesn't actually, if we went back to our let example here and we declared a const in here, it would also not exist outside of this scope. But global variables you can always reassign, unless they were declared const globally, I guess. So again, we can look at another example. Like we can see here, if I pull up my my console, and I declare this, that's really declaring it globally. It's just a global const. And so I can get the answer back out, but I shouldn't be able to change the value of it because it's never supposed to be changed. So let and const variables can be declared globally, although technically they sort of can't. It doesn't end up actually mattering. You can treat them like they can be declared globally. And I think, again, I think I've mentioned this before. If somebody wants to come and present what this means, feel free. But another difference between var and let or const is that their declaration is not hoisted to the top of the scope. Again, don't worry if you that. But if you want to look it up, you want to come and explain it to us, love to have you come and explain what hoisting a variable means. It's sort of a unique aspect of JavaScript. It's a little bit of a quirky thing. And so with let and const, since those are newer, they followed a pattern that's more familiar with other programming languages. All right, this one you guys should be really comfortable with. This one is not too different from what we do all the time. Template literals, we've been writing these for a long time, right? Template literals are just these strings. They're using the backtick character instead of quotes. And when you do that, you can intersperse these expanded items, these variables, using this special syntax that will be interpreted and inserted directly in your actually generated string. So they're a very, very useful way to write something out in a easier to read fashion than using string concatenation or something else. And you'll see them a lot in React style code, because a lot of React code is UI code that needs to change. You know, maybe it's a group in the top of your application, right? Hello, Jared. Well, it's really nice to be able to write that as a template literal. And another important thing to recognize, because you'll encounter this in React code, is that any JavaScript expression, it doesn't matter what the expression is, can be contained in the template literal. So here we've written this square function. Now look, I have the variables named correctly this time. All right, fix my problem. And in this console log, instead of just referencing a variable, we're actually invoking the square function with 12 right there inside of that template literal. So that's also another pattern that you'll see quite frequently in React style code, is they may just nest a call to a function in the template literal or something, because it just makes it very concise in terms of what's going on. And sometimes it even reads easier, right? Like here, the square of 12 is, oh, square 12. It's almost redundant in terms of how it reads. So sometimes it makes it really easy to read your code when you nest them that way. All right, the next new one, and this one we didn't do it anywhere near as much as template literals. So this one, some people might still be uncomfortable with, but you definitely need to get used to it when we start writing React code, is arrow functions. So we've been writing functions, since like the second week of class, if not the first week. And the most basic way of writing a function is what's known as the function declaration. That's the syntax that we've always written, which is function, the function name, variables, or any parameters for it, etc., with the curly braces. Another way that we've written them, a little bit, but not as frequently, is what's known as a function expression. A function expression is used to create a function and assign it to a variable name. So like here we have let is even equals this function, and then it checks, oh, it returns not is odd. All right. You'll see this sometimes because it makes it easy to sort of pass around a function, although you can refer to a function when you wrote it with a function declaration as well. But this is sort of a common pattern when you're passing a function into something else. So an example is like a function expression of, oh, here we have a function expression that's right here and just created in this nums.map, which is going to square each number in our list of numbers. And it's a function expression because we're not explicitly declaring it with the function keyword. But you notice we're not even giving it a variable name either. So this is an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. It's just getting passed into this map and used and then discarded and doesn't exist anymore outside of that scope. So those are both still older syntaxes. But now we've got this new syntax, which is the arrow function or arrow function expression. It looks different from the traditional one and supports a few different syntax variations, but they're really popular in React, so we need to get sort of comfortable with them. This is one of those slides that just makes a really good reference if you're trying to remember how to write these arrow functions or how they work, because it sort of shows the 3 different ways that they can be written and you might encounter them. I would suggest that you just go ahead and stick with this top way when you're writing them yourself, just for consistency's sake, but all of these will work. So an arrow function, you assign it to a variable if you're doing that, or if we just nested inside of that map like we had before, you could do that as well. But the way it works is instead of having function or that function keyword anywhere, it just takes the arguments for the function or the list of parameters wrapped in parentheses, and then it uses an equals sign and the greater than symbol, so it's an arrow, haha. And then it just returns whatever you want to return there. So that syntax is just a little different than our traditional function syntax, but there's a couple other ways that it can be simplified in some cases, which is if you only need a single parameter for your function, so like this one example where, oh, it's just going to add 1 to whatever number we pass in, you don't actually even have to put the parentheses around your arguments or your parameters. And if it only performs 1 step and you just want it to directly return the value of that single step, you don't care, you don't need multiple steps, then you don't have to have the curly braces in a return statement. If you exclude those, this will automatically return the result of evaluating this first expression in this arrow function. So that's sort of a nice syntax. You'll definitely encounter this a lot. And then you'll get into some cases where they'll chain them too. So there'll be cases where, and this is where it can be hard to read and hard to get used to, but you'll definitely encounter cases where it might do something like this. Var square add 1 equals, take the number, and what we want to return from that is, see, it's hard for me. I need to get this all correct. Okay. Oh man, I'm trying to do this on the fly. Let me see if I can do this. I think I'll have to, I don't know if I can write it that way right now. Yeah. You'll have to give you an example of that later, I think. I mean, yes, I was trying to show something a little weird because you'll encounter situations where the code will be like this or whatever, like let square add num or something like that. So this is going to be really weird, and I don't expect you to be able to be comfortable with this syntax, right? So I'm going to call this first one original number. And what that's going to return is a function that's going to take an add number, which is going to take the original number, which is going to return the original number times the original number plus the add number. Oh, I have something wrong here. Let me fix that. It should be easy. This first thing isn't an arrow. All right. And now this is sort of weird because it's actually like nested functions. So I can pass in a number and then I can invoke it a second time. And that's going to call those individual functions. You're going to end up encountering that, and that's going to be some complicated bits of code. But the key to when you encounter stuff like this is to think about breaking it down piece by piece and working with it that way. So always try and break some of that stuff down. Again, don't feel too intimidated by what I just wrote right now, but try and, if you can think about it, try and break down exactly what happened here. Because we invoked the original one, passing in our original number. And then what that returned, so if I showed you what happened there, let add num equals square add num of 4, what add num is actually a function. And so then we can call that, which is this function here, and pass in whatever we want to add, in this case 2, and it's going to finish evaluating that whole thing. Again, don't get too hung up on it, but those are some of the things you'll encounter because of the simplicity of writing arrow functions. You'll see some stuff written out in that sort of way. And you might really like writing stuff that way. Right? I don't know. It all depends on what your preferences are. All right, so that's review. If anybody has any questions on the review, let me know. If not, we'll start talking a little bit about React. We're not going to get into too much of the code today, but I want to give you some of the background, some of the high-level concepts. I want to start talking about why we want to use React. So let's start off with, why should you learn React? Why is it a useful framework to learn? And really, the key reasons I would say is there's a huge, large is almost understating it, a huge React community now. There's so many developers, there's dedicated conferences to it. It's one of the largest frameworks in the world in terms of development frameworks, which means that there's a lot of advantage to leveraging or using React, right? If we go take a look at some of these, and these are a little old, numbers have probably only gone up since this time. And we take a look at, let me see here, technologies used. You can see frameworks. Really, the only one that had a higher number in 2018 was Angular. Node, I wouldn't necessarily call it a framework. It's really a whole backend development thing, but React was massive. And I don't know if we'll have, let me see if the 2019 has the same. I don't know. Let's see what we got here. Oh, React is right there at the top in terms of web frameworks. Now it's overtaken Angular. That's one of the main reasons, right? Just huge demand. If we went back and looked at this other one, and we were looking at, let me see here, JavaScript frameworks, you can see that React has a lot of people feel comfortable using it. It's probably the highest in that category for all of that. So outside of jQuery, which just means that with all of that demand, it's a really, really useful tool set to be leveraging and to be learning. And with the huge community around it, you're never going to be far from getting an answer to a question. And then this is one of these things I really recommend at this point in your development journey, right? Is you started to learn a language, and there are a lot of frameworks out there. There's a lot of different tools that you could try and learn, different things that you could try and learn. Especially as a new developer, your tendency is to bounce around. Oh, I want to try this. Oh, no, I'm having a hard time with that. Oh, let me go try this other thing instead. Oh, that's a little challenging. Let me go over here and try this one. I really encourage you to try to avoid that because, and I have a nice Bruce Lee quote here, but it really is true that if you learn one of these frameworks, one of these tools, one of these environments, well, then not only will you already have something that you can is a marketable skill, but it will make it a lot easier to understand the other ones. So instead of feeding into that tendency, which I know I have done many times, of sort of bouncing around and learning a little bit about all these different things, I encourage you to really dive deep into, in this case, React, since you're in the React course, and really start getting comfortable in that environment instead of trying to bounce around to another one if you encounter a little bit of a difficulty or anything else. So what is React? Like, I'm talking about this framework. Look, they don't even call it that in the React documentation. They just call it a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. There's some interesting things missing from this description here. Because I probably would have thought, React is a framework for building web UIs or for building web pages. Or if you're familiar with this concept, I would have thought it's a model view controller framework. But actually, neither of those statements are true. React can go beyond the web. There are other places you can write React code and have it work. There's something called React Native, which lets you write React code. And then it creates a native mobile application on the different platforms, running actual native code, not web code. There's React for a whole bunch of different environments. So really, it is specific to creating user interfaces, not to creating a web page. And that's another reason that React is really useful, is because it can be used to sort of jump between these different domains. If you're really good with React, then it's not as hard to pick up React Native and start building out a native mobile application. Yes, there's a learning curve around it, but it's not as significant as it would be if you decided, oh, I'm just going to start building this mobile application using all the native tooling. That's a much higher learning curve. So what are some of the features of React? What makes it a unique or useful tool? And we're going to talk about each one of these, and there's a lot more as well, but these are some of the ones I wanted to focus on in this first class when we're just sort of diving in and starting to talk about what's going on with React. So React is declarative. For that in a moment. It's component-based. It's composable. It's got this awesome little JavaScript extension aspect called JSX. And then one of the things that probably gets talked about the most in most Intro to React talks or anything else, even though you don't actually encounter it that much, it's sort of the magic behind the scenes that you don't need to see, is this concept of a virtual DOM, or essentially how that works. I think they've actually moved off of it. I don't even think they like the terminology anymore, but that's a really powerful concept. So let's dive into some of these a little bit, right? What does it mean to be declarative? What is a declarative programming language or framework? So there's there's a lot of ways to write code, but let's compare imperative versus declarative. Imperative code says how to change the state of something. So imperative code is concerned with how do I change a state to get somewhere else? For example, jQuery, or when we do some direct DOM manipulation, right? Like when, I can just load this page even. And if I'm here and I say documents dot write. Look, I've obviously done this before. It's still in my history. That was imperative because I told the document, okay, this is your new state. And then I could do more imperative changes, right? An example of doing that without writing code is, oh, if I come over here and I change this to say, that was a imperative change. So what I did was I told it how to change. I told it exactly what to do there in terms of changing. Declarative is different. Declarative code says what the state of something should be, but not how to get there in its current state. So that first document.write that I did, that was sort of declarative as well, because that was saying, oh, here's the state of the document. This is what you should be. Just render that. A great example of that is traditional websites, right? Like if I'm on, this is the first website ever re-rendered. If we go here and we look at what's going on, say in the network tab, every time I click on something, it takes me to an entirely new web page. And that web page is declaratively rendered because what got returned was all of the HTML for that web page. So it didn't modify my web page at all. It's a whole new web page and all of the things that it needed to render that web page. Now, if we were to do that imperatively, that's usually what you're doing with Ajax type calls, where you're updating just a portion of your web page, right? So we're very much used to that. If I went to, I mean, really just about anywhere else. Let's here. I'm pretty sure Google is going to just do partial updates of its web page. So I don't think, you know, that this whole web page re-rendered. What it did was it re-rendered portions of it, not the entire thing. And so we're very, very used to that sort of model. But there's pros and cons to each approach. So let's talk about what these differences are in a real world situation, because maybe they'll make more sense, right? A declarative type behavior, it's really the difference between ordering a meal at a restaurant. That's declarative. You go there and you say, I'll have the steak and eggs, the eggs over easy, the steak medium rare. You just declared what you wanted. And then the kitchen staff went off and cooked it. And they followed whatever instructions they follow in order to cook that item. You didn't sit there and walk them through it. The imperative version of that is if you're at home and you're following a recipe, right? That's imperative. It's telling you, okay, measure out this much, put that in the pan, cook that for 5 minutes, mix these things, and then bake them together. That's a very imperative process. So really it's not like one of these is better than the other, but they do allow you to do different things in a different way. And again, comparing, React is declarative, whereas something like jQuery, which is all about changing little bits of your existing web page, that's imperative. One of the nice things that this declarative aspect does is, when it comes to web development, is it allows us to remove the need to figure out how to transition the program or the whatever you have from one state to another, because that can get really complicated, right? Like if we go here and we've got our Google page, for example, let's look at all the elements on this page. And, you know, I could probably choose a much more complicated page. Think about what it would take if, you know, you were trying to make sure, oh, I want to change this and I want to, or I want to add, I don't know where everything is even rendered in here. Oh, here we go. So, if you're working on this span or something, and you're like, oh, I want to add a class to it, or I want to remove a class from it. It might be tricky to do that because I have to find the right span. I have to find the location. I have to make sure that I'm adding and removing it, but not changing into the other classes, and that everything else stays the same in the way I want it to be, right? So there's a lot of work involved when you're making changes on a website in an imperative fashion, because a lot of times you have to know what state you're going from and what state you're going to, which means that you have to have special logic that says, oh, if I was in state A and I'm going to state B, change it this way. But if I was in state A and I'm going to C, then I make a different change, right? So that can get really complicated really fast. Whereas with React, what you say, I want to be in state C, and it handles the process for you. And we'll talk in a minute about how it actually does that. We won't get into really deep details today, but you guys are definitely going to see that throughout this class, is exactly what React is doing that makes that sort of simple. So next bit, React is component based. And again, you'll see this when I do the little bit of hands-on. It's going to be a very small example today. But React applications are composed of components that each manage their own state. So you build it up out of these small little components, and it makes reusing the components, since they each sort of manage their own state, really easy. You can reuse them in multiple places on the same web page. You can reuse them in different applications. In fact, this was really one of the major driving forces behind React originally. It's sort of funny. Facebook created React, and one of the problems that they had was, if you're ever on, let me see here, like if you're ever on Facebook and you saw this icon, it's like, oh, you've got something going on, there's something new, right? That was constantly getting out of sync, where it would be like showing that there was something new even though there shouldn't be. And one of their big challenges was they're like, oh my gosh, this thing is not in sync, and it's causing us all sorts of problems. And that was one of their driving forces behind building out React, was having all of this stuff be in sync in a very useful, consistent way. So when you've got these components, the thing that makes them really nice is you can build these small components and then you can compose them. And this will really focus a lot on in this course. It's very, very similar to how you compose HTML for like a website, right? Like if we were to go here, we'd say, oh, this div is composed of 2 divs and a span. 2 divs, a span, and another div, right? So that's what it's composed of. And see this nested div here, it doesn't have to know anything about the div above it. This div above it just said, oh, render another div with some values, render this, and then this div has a whole bunch more in it, right? And React follows that exact same model, and in fact, you end up writing out your code in a very similar way. And one of the main reasons you're able to write it out in a similar way is because of this JSX concept. So this one, really, I would say just learn the term. Exactly how it works isn't that important, but it's a syntax extension to JavaScript. So what it lets you do is it lets you write HTML-like syntax directly in a JavaScript file. In reality, it doesn't let you put it directly in a JavaScript file. You have to, if you guys remember near the end of the last class, we did some stuff using a transpiler. I showed Babel a little bit to convert some code from ES6 to ES5. That's exactly what you use for JSX2, is you run it through a tool that will convert the JSX to actual code. And I can show you an example of what that looks like. But yeah, we'll be using JSX pretty much in all of the React components that we do. And I think once you see it, I mean, it quickly becomes something, to me at least, that's just sort of invisible. It just is behind the scenes. It's just, I think it's really nice. It just sort of blends into your development workflow. It's a lot nicer than working with the other templating models that I've worked with for web development. And then we get to, this is the sort of magic sauce that puts it all together. I talked about how React is declarative. React lets you just declare, oh, I just want to be in this state. The virtual DOM, or essentially what React is doing behind the scenes, is how you're able to write your code declaratively in the first place. Because if you remember, I go back to this, first website in the world, it can take a little while to click to different pages and load stuff. And this one's a very, very simple web page. There's not much going on here. So if there was a lot going on, if these pages were complex with a lot of images, a lot of text, a lot of JavaScript code that had to be loaded, then reloading the entire web page every time you navigate around somewhere would be very, very costly, right? It's not a particularly good idea because it would just be so slow. Like imagine if you were on Twitter and instead of it just rendering that box, it had to re-render the whole web page, which might take, I don't know, depending on if you're on your laptop with a fast internet connection or your phone, it might take 1 second or it might take 30 seconds for it to update every time, right? Because that could be a lot of stuff it needs to download and a lot of stuff to re-render. Well, React handles that behind the scenes. And this is this magic bit. We'll get into this a little bit, although again, it's a magic that you don't really need to care too much about. Because basically what React will do is it virtually re-renders the whole web page or all of your React components in your React DOM. And then it does a comparison against the current state of the web page. And it checks or it just diffs the two and says, oh, what actually changed here and what didn't? And it takes only the pieces that changed and puts those into the DOM for you. So all bit about how do you modify the DOM to be in the state you want it to be in is all handled by this virtual DOM layer of React. It abstracts that away from you. So instead you get to think of just like, what do I want it to look like right now? I don't care about what it looked like before, and declare that, and it'll be in that state. Again, this will make a lot of sense as we work through this course, but these are these sort of core concepts, the building blocks that are really going to make up why React is such a powerful tool, and also why it works different than some other tools that you might be familiar with. So, revisiting these occasionally throughout the course will be really useful because it'll help you go, oh yeah, that's why it works different than when we did jQuery work or something else. So let's go ahead and let's look at some examples. Again, like I said, I'm going to use REPL-IT today for the examples. And then you guys can give me some feedback on, I'm probably going to regret this because it's going to have to reload everything. You guys give me some feedback on how you feel about it in terms of the REPL environment and whether you think it felt very comfortable from what you're seeing. So what we've got here, I mean, this should look somewhat similar to the Cloud9 environment, except our side panel is over on the side here instead of down below. And I've got a few different places. Here is sort of our console output, but you can't interact with it the same way. It's just showing you what's happening when it builds. And this is your preview window rendering whatever is in your React application. So in just a minute, this will actually render, it should, oh, there we go. Should render our actual application. So this is an example of one of the most minimal React applications you could put into a web page. And really, we're not even using any React components in this. And we're not even using the React core bit here that much. We're using DOM. You might be thinking, well, why are these separate? That goes back to what I talked about early on, that React is UI agnostic. It doesn't care if you're rendering into a DOM or rendering into a native web app necessarily. So you need a way to bind it to these different environments. And that's what React DOM is. React DOM is the smaller library that says, oh, how do I actually hook a React application into the web browser, into a DOM? And this is really probably the most that we'll just about ever use from React DOM. We almost never invoke more than this one method. We call React DOM.render. And what you pass in is an element. And don't worry about that terminology. We'll dig into that a lot more. But it gets an actual element. And then you tell it where to bind that element in the DOM. So this is actually just straight up DOM call, right? This is document.getElementById root. So that has nothing to do with React. It's just getting a reference to root element in our document, and then it's saying render this element, React element, at that point in the document. Now in this, what's interesting is even in this very small file here, we're already introducing several React components, because this right here, if you'll notice, I don't have quotes around this. This isn't some string. This is just something that looks like HTML directly in my JavaScript file. But it's not HTML. Oops, I need a different quote maybe. I don't know, we'll see. It's JSX. It's a good question. Root is not the name of the file. Root is the name of where it's being mounted in the DOM here. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to inspect this internally nested thing. Let me see. Oh, it looks like I can. All right. So if we look at body here, root is the ID that contains our React code. So it's just getElementById root. So here's the ID we're getting, and we just have a reference to that, and we're saying now render this React content inside of that element. So that's what we have right there. So yeah, I mean, hopefully this didn't even seem that strange to you, but boy, is that powerful. I was able to write something that just looks like markup, HTML markup, directly in my line right here. If you remember before, like let's pull up those dev tools again, and I had this. I'm not going to run this, but let's look at the. I mean, look at how ugly that is. I have to put these quotes and stuff, and as it grows, it gets uglier when I want to do a string like that. And if I wanted to do something really large, it would get even more complex. But here, I can just write this just like it's HTML, and it will work with it. It's a good question. So really, by using JSX and React, you never have content in an HTML file. An HTML file becomes more of just a framework, and the actual content is created and placed into the framework using React. That's close to a true statement. Sometimes you can keep it separate if you want. Some places love to keep them separate in a separate like template file. But the React model, so I'm gonna go off on a small sidetrack here, but before React came along, there was this concept of there is a concept which is known as the separation of concerns, right? You want to keep things that are different separate. And so what that led to was, oh, we've got an HTML file, and then we have a CSS file, and then we have a JavaScript file. And the JavaScript file might modify the HTML when it renders, and the CSS will give it styling, but we kept those in separate files. And one of the key things that the React team at was they were saying, is that really the separation of concerns? That's really, or seems more like a separation of technologies, not a separation of concerns, right? Oh, HTML technologies here and JavaScript's here. Whereas, you know, the concept of React is to have everything concerned with one aspect of or one component contained together. And I'll show that hopefully a little better when I create our first component in just a moment, in terms of keeping it all together. But that was one of the driving forces behind this JSX syntax was, oh, really the template or the markup is all part of that concern. So why should it be in a separate file? So that sort of helped drive this concept of nesting the JSX directly in your other code. Oh yeah. So what's great about this? Let's look at this even more. We can make this more complicated. We can put other markup in this if we want to. Like, oh, we want this to be emphasized, and that is just fine. So we can, and in fact, we can even structure this if we want. So I can bring this down on this next line and move this in here. And oh, we lost our white space because remember, it collapses all white space. So we sort of lost that. But whatever, not a big deal. Maybe I can put one here. I don't think that'll work, but oh, it did. All right. So we can make this look literally like a formatted bit of HTML and write it right here inside of our JavaScript file, which is really nice. So now let's actually create a React component, right? And again, I'm not going to go too deep into this today. I really wanted to focus on the concepts at first, but let's create a React component so that we can reuse it or have an actual component. So I'm going to create the most basic type of you can create, which is just a function component. And this function component is just going to return. I'm going to take everything that I had here and return it from my function component. But because I like formatting and I like stuff to be indented nicely, I'm going to put curly braces around it, or put parentheses around it, I mean, because that way I can start my H1 on the line below my return. Otherwise, it's sort of not laid out, not very easy to read. But you could do it that way and just return like, oh no, you can't. It all has to be on that same line, I think. Oh no, it looks like it's working. I don't know why, but I like the parentheses because that's just saying this is all part of what I'm returning. This is my expression. And then it makes it nice and easy to work with. Oh, wait, I forgot I had this down here. Yeah, you can't have it on separate lines. I think it wouldn't work if you broke it out. So then you need to put these sort of parentheses. We're not using this anywhere yet though, right? Oh, let me rename this. Because by convention, we name React components starting with an uppercase. There's no rule, but your component names by convention start with an uppercase. So here we've got this great hello world function, but it's not being used. So how can I use it? Well, these are just HTML elements. I can instead call this function, which is returning these HTML elements, using that same JSX syntax. So now it's almost like, if you want to think about it that way, almost like I created my own custom HTML element here, right? And I'm able to write that down here in this JSX, and it knows, oh, when I encounter this, what I actually want to do is call this function and then insert the results of calling that function right here. And render it. So let me see if this will work. I think I want to go to I don't know if this will work or not. Let's see. So here we go. Okay. Not exactly the cleanest bit of code, but if you remember, we went to this Babel site before. This is sort of showing you what it actually generates in JavaScript code. So if we skip some of these bits at the top that are just setting something up, here's our hello world function, which is saying, oh, return this React code that says create an element that's in H1 that has nothing as its first item, and then has the string hello world with this in there. And then inside of that, create an HTML element of an EM, which has space imjsx. And down here, create an element that just calls this hello world, right? That is this same React code. If you were, without some of this, like underscore bits, some of that could be simpler, but that's how you would write this, this same code if you were writing it without using JSX. It gets pretty ugly, right? That's not easy to read. But with the JSX, it's very easy to read. It's very easy to sort of understand what's going on there. At least I hope it is. Let me know if you feel differently, but I think it's really simple to sort of understand what this is doing. So now we can also compose our custom components the same way that we were composing anything else. So we don't even have to have the content in here. We can compose these up the same sort of way. An example of that would be, I'm going to take this guy out and make him its own little function, which is just going to return. And since this is all one line now, I can do it without having all that extra, like the parentheses and stuff. I can just return here. And then what I'm going to do is inside of this, oops, again, like to start all of our components with an uppercase name. I'll just render this JSX component. And it works. So we're sort of, now you begin to see some of these pieces I was talking about, right? If we go back, oh, what is this? This is a component, all right? That's one of those things I mentioned, one of these basic building blocks. It's component based. And this is composition. We've composed this hello world and are able to use this JSX component, right? And we can continue to do that over and over. In fact, maybe we want what we render here to be a little more complex. Maybe this is a div that says hello world. So it renders that component. And I need to close my div, need to make sure I always write my stuff correctly. Oops, indent that. And then maybe after that, I'll render JSX again. And that renders it a second time. And now we're composing, we're even getting that reuse. Here's our component being reused. It's used here and it's used here. And we get a lot of value out of being able to do that. Why isn't I'm JSX written before hello world? Are you talking about it with the newest syntax? You need to think about where, again, remember, these are functions. And these are called, it's just declared here, it's not invoked. So this isn't actually being invoked until we render it somewhere, which means it gets invoked here, and that's where it's going to insert the results of evaluating it, not when it's declared. I think that answers that question in terms of why it isn't happening first. If not, let me know. I can try and describe it again. There any other questions so far from what we've covered? So I don't want to introduce too much complexity right now. I want to try and keep it simple, but there's one other type of component that we'll be encountering a ton. So these are what are known as function components. This is the simplest version of a component that you can create. But there are also class components. We'll dive into that a lot more in a future class. But you can write any component. Well, not any component is a function component, but any component can be written as a class component. There are some restrictions on what can be a functional component. So if I were to change this hello world, and I'm going to make it a class component instead, I'm actually going to copy stuff and then I'll comment it out. But I can do a class hello world extends react.component render. Yeah, I need to do some. Get some spacing right. Let me see if this will work. It probably won't, but I'm going to try it. Hey, it did. All right, let's see if this works. I've got something wrong with my syntax. All right, let me check. I don't think that's right. It should be class. All right. Check what's wrong with my syntax very fast. Probably just missing a curly brace somewhere. Let me see here. Oh, there we go. It rendered. It was just delayed. It looks like it just had a delay from where it was at. So that's me changing it to a class component. And I would say don't worry too much about that. But the only real thing that ended up happening was I did all this class bit. And then inside of what's known as render method, I told it what to return. Like, what does this component actually render? And we'll dive into that a lot more in upcoming classes. But those are the two major ways that you can declare components in React, is as a function component and as a class component. And there's pros and cons to each version of them. I tend to, this is sort of funny because it doesn't match up exactly with that const stuff I described before, but I tend to have a preference to start components as functional components until I know that I need the functionality that doesn't work on a function component. And to be honest, React just recently, literally earlier this year, introduced a whole new paradigm that allows function components to be used in all contexts, I believe. But I don't know if we're going to get to that concept or not, because it's still a pretty fresh concept for React. And I want to focus on these sort of core elements instead. Any questions about what we've covered with this? Again, where we're at in terms of being able to work with this React content. So let me just show a couple of the small things before we end for today of just, some cool things that you can do. So again, don't worry about the details of this. We'll dive into this a lot more. So components can take what's known as props, and those are values that you pass into them. And the interesting thing is, I'm going to change this. I'm not going to call this JSX anymore. Oops. Oh, wow, it's going to let me do that. Oh, that's so cool. I'm just going to say greeting. So I'm changing it to a greeting. And I can hard code it to say, like, I'm Jared. Right? Okay, cool. I've got a greeting in there. Yes, I've got some weird spacing issue here. Which I would need to fix, but for that. But what if I want to be able to change this greeting, right? What if different people, oh, this greeting should be, I want this to be reused by anybody. Well, I passed something in, which is this special thing called props. And now I can read that in here. And if I say, I'm going to turn this into a string literal or a template literal, so I can just inline it. I'm going to say props.name. Let me see. I might need curly braces to make that work, or it may not work without a little other. I'm $. Oh, maybe it's because this is undefined. We'll see. So the way that I get something in there for one of those is I pass in just a name property right on it like this. Let's see if this works. Oh, I forgot. This is JSX. JSX already has its own way of injecting stuff. I don't even have to do the template literal. JSX, you only have to do these curly braces, just like that. So there we go. Now it's reading that value straight off of this props, which is awesome because I could give different names to each one of these. Let me see. Say Alex. And then it will render this function with those prop values and let this bit of code not change, right? So now we've got a nice bit of reusable component. We can start passing things in and modifying the way that component renders each time that it renders an element. And that will really be the crux of how we'll be able to build something powerful out using building a React application. Again, we'll dive into this a lot more detail. I want to at least get started with it and then get you guys sort of looking at this. What I would say is outside of class, you should definitely check out the official React documentation. You can start looking at it. It's probably going to be pretty hefty right now for you, but they've got deep documentation going heavily into stuff. They've got a tutorial. This tutorial is sort of what I plan on having us go through in class, just in a lot more detail and introducing the concepts in more detail as well. And then we may touch on some of these other concepts as well from their section over here. Let me look at this last question and then we'll probably be done. So let's see what we have here. So a component would be like a feature of a site or an app. Said Facebook started React. So one component would be the area that shows new messages, posts, and one component would show the feed, and one component would hold your account settings and features. Yes, in a sense, that's very true. A component is really a UI element. Give you work. Very specific bit of homework. I think I already did though before, but I want you guys to read over it again. Where is it? Thinking in React. So this, especially this first section of this, up through at least section 1 of this on Thinking in React, I want you guys to read through this. I want you to read through that because that'll help you think about how to break stuff up into components. And that's going to be one of the key things to being successful with building out React applications is learning how to look at a UI or learning how to think about what you want to build out and then being able to break it down into these pieces. So I think this is an incredibly useful guide, and we're going to be doing some of this at the start of some of our classes as well, because really useful, where instead of just coding, or maybe as homework, it'll be, oh, here's a small piece of a UI. What components would you come up with to build that out, right? Because that's sort of the first thing that you need to be able to do to be successful. Otherwise, you might have a habit of building components that are too large. And you're going to be a lot more successful when you build out really small components that can compose something large. And you'll see that as we build out sort of follow their tutorial and their application. All right, there's no other questions tonight. I think we're going to call it done for tonight. Hopefully I can find another video live streaming tool or figure out how to use the actual new YouTube one correctly before August 1st. We will have a small gap around then because I am gone. When am I gone? I'm gone the 30th through the 1st as well. So that means, let me check those days. Is that a Thursday? Yeah, it's a Thursday, or 30th through the 4th. So that'll be that Thursday and Saturday. I won't be here. I might just try and create some content for you ahead of time, but I already know I'm going to be out on those days. And then other than that, looking forward to seeing everyone on Thursday. Again, if you have a really strong preference, you got a chance to see some of this REPL IT stuff today, what that workflow looked like. It is a pretty simple workflow, but it might restrict some of the options that we would have in terms of packages we can use and stuff. But if you prefer that, or if you'd rather just say, no, I really want to build out my own local workspace and have it working on my laptop, you know, speak up, let me know, and I'll take that into consideration as try and figure out what environment we'll use as we build stuff out on Thursday. Thursday is going to be mostly hands-on, just trying to make sure everyone's able to build a very simple basic React application so that we'll all be starting from that same base. And I will talk to you guys later.